Imagine becoming the best in the world, and instead of being celebrated, you're hunted, hated, and criminalized. That's exactly what happened to Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion, who didn't just win fights, he broke a system. Jack Johnson's rise mattered because he wasn't just another boxer winning matches. He was a black man rising to the very top in a period of American history when society was built on the idea that black people were supposed to stay beneath white people in every visible way. His success challenged more than sports. It challenged the racial order of America. When Johnson became the first black heavyweight champion, it shook the country because the heavyweight title was seen as the ultimate symbol of manhood, strength, and superiority in that era. And many white Americans had attached racial meaning to that title. So when Johnson won it, they didn't simply see a boxer winning a belt. They saw a black man publicly disproving the lie of white supremacy. And that's what made his victory so threatening. He was calm, skilled, intelligent, and impossible to dismiss. You can say he was like the Muhammad Ali of his day. He was brash, he was in your face, and white people didn't like it. He wasn't fitting the role society wanted for him. He was beating white opponents in the open, in front of crowds, in front of newspapers, in front of the whole world. Jack Johnson didn't just win a championship, he shattered a racial myth in public. Now, you can say that America could tolerate black labor, black entertainment, and black struggle, but it couldn't tolerate black supremacy in the ring, especially the most prestigious division in boxing, the heavyweight division. You know, one of the biggest reasons Jack Johnson drew so much hatred is not only that he won, but how he carried himself while winning. He was confident, stylish, outspoken, and unapologetic. He didn't act nervous around white society, and he didn't make himself smaller to make others comfortable. And that made many people furious, especially when it came to women, because he had a taste for vanilla. Oh yeah. He loved having his white women, and white society couldn't stand it. But here's the thing. They couldn't stand it, and at the same time, they couldn't touch him. They were afraid to confront him one-on-one, and he was so brash and being so open. And there is a pattern in history when some people see a black man with confidence. They don't call it confidence. They call it arrogance, disrespect, or danger. Kind of like the way in this series, when I've shown Fred Price, they refer to him as arrogant. But with Johnson, he smiled, he dressed well, drove flashy cars, and enjoyed attention, and lived with a kind of freedom that many black people back in that era wasn't supposed to have. He was seen as too bold, but the real issue was that he refused to act inferior. And that's what infuriated a lot of white people. See, a black person can be celebrated as long as they stay non-threatening, stay in their lane, be quiet. Now, they can be entertaining, but on someone else's terms. But once they become too independent, too assertive, or too successful, the label changes quickly. And Jack Johnson exposed that hypocrisy, the same swagger that would be praised in others was condemned in him because of who he was. They didn't just hate his success, they hated the fact that he enjoyed it. See, society often accepts black excellence only when it's wrapped in submission. And Johnson was excellent without permission. You know, the fight with Jim Jeffries became bigger than boxing because white America turned Jeffries into a racial symbol. He was called the Great White Hope, and this is the first time that phrase came about. And that tells you everything. This wasn't simply about finding a better fighter. It was about finding a white man who could restore the racial pride that Jack Johnson had damaged by becoming champion. And again, that phrase, great white hope, is one of the clearest examples of how openly racial the whole situation was. Johnson wasn't just fighting another athlete. He was fighting an expectation, a fantasy, and a national racial wound. White America had wanted Jeffries to defeat Johnson so the racial hierarchy could be symbolically repaired, but Johnson beat him. And that victory was devastating to many people because it proved that the hope they had built around race was empty. Johnson won with skill, patience, and superiority. And once the fight was over, racial tensions exploded. And that's how it was with white people of that ilk, whereas if they saw that they were getting beaten something, they went out and rioted. Yeah. Just think about Black Wall Street. As I said, once the fight was over, racial tensions exploded. Riots and violence followed in different places because people could not emotionally process what they had just seen or heard. And that tells you something powerful. Racism is often strongest when its lies are publicly exposed. And Jack Johnson exposed one of the biggest lies of his time. And the reaction showed how deeply that lie had been embedded in the culture. See, the fight was never just Johnson versus Jeffries. It was truth versus a racial fantasy. See, you can point out that a whole society places its pride in racial superiority. A single event can become unbearable if it disproves that belief. After Johnson proved they could not beat him fairly in the ring, the pressure shifted outside the ring. And this is where the story becomes even darker. It was no longer enough to hate him socially. The system moved toward punishing him legally. Jack Johnson became a target under the Mann Act, and that was a law that was supposedly about stopping immoral trafficking. But in his case, it became a tool of selective enforcement, and many believe the real issue was not moral concern in general. The real issue was that Johnson openly had relationships with white women, as I previously stated, and that was something racist America couldn't tolerate. And this showed how racism not only operates through insults, mobs, or newspapers, it also works through institutions. Courts, laws, and law enforcement can all become tools for punishing the person who crossed the line society wanted to keep in place. And Johnson's case becomes a lesson in how systems often pretend to be neutral while being used very selectively. And he was treated as if he were some sort of special moral threat. But the deeper offense was racial. He represented a level of freedom that white society wanted to crush. So when you say when they couldn't beat him in the ring, they beat him in the courts, that line lands because it reveals the shift from physical competition to systemic retaliation. Think about it. They couldn't defeat his fists, so they weaponized the law. See, power often changes methods when it can't win fairly. First ridicule, then outrage, then legal pressure. You know, this point is especially important for this series because it moves the conversation from history into moral accountability. The religious angle isn't that Jack Johnson himself was primarily known as a religious figure. The point is that America in that time claimed Christian identity while tolerating, justifying, or participating in racist attitudes and struggles and structures. And this is where the church has to be examined honestly. Many Christians in that era went to church on Sunday and still embraced racial superiority the rest of the week. And some churches were silent, some were segregated, and some used twisted theology to uphold the racial system. And instead of confronting injustice, religion often went to cover it up. Johnson's life exposed the contradiction between what many people claim to believe and how they actually behave. You can't say all people are equal before God and then rage because a black man became champion. You can't quote the Bible and then support a social order built on humiliation and hierarchy. And this is where scriptures like Galatians 3:28 and James 2:1 become powerful, because the Bible condemns partiality, but partiality was deeply embedded in American life, including church life. So the religious point is not just racism existed, it's that many people wrap racism in moral language while ignoring the very teachings they claim to follow. And the thing is, religion should have confronted racism, but too often it coexisted with it. And that's because of the people behind it. Therefore, if people were truly following Christ, why would a black man's excellence feel like an offense? Jack Johnson isn't just a history lesson. He's a symbol. He represents what happens when a black man becomes too visible, too strong, and too free, and also too impossible to control. His story still matters because the reaction to black excellence hasn't disappeared. It just changed forms. Today, the names and settings may be different, but the pattern is familiar. When a black person succeeds quietly, some people applaud. And when that same person becomes influential, bold, wealthy, and outspoken, or unwilling to bow, the backlash often comes quickly. And suddenly they become divisive, or they're called divisive, arrogant, dangerous, and ungrateful. So Johnson's story still speaks because it reveals a truth that stretches across generations. Some people aren't upset by wrongdoing, they're upset by the collapse of the hierarchy they used to have. And that's why his story belongs in a series like this. It's not old news, it's a recurring pattern. Jack Johnson's story is old, but the reaction to black freedom is still the same. So in conclusion, Jack Johnson wasn't hated not because he was weak, but because he was strong. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded. Not because he broke the sport, but because he broke the lie. He showed what happens when a black man rises in a world that has already decided how high he's allowed to go. And when he went higher than expected, the hatred exposed itself. So continue to renew your mind. Enough said.